in collaboration with the Cyprus Mail. This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
On this week's programme, having been closed since February of last year, the checkpoints between the north and south of the island finally open today.
Really rough calculations, I reckon it cost the Greek Cypriot economy maybe about 65 million and the Turkish Cypriot economy maybe as much as 80 million.
And we deconstruct those parliamentary elections last weekend, looking at voting habits.
The vast majority of people do not trust politicians and the parties, so that's one of the reasons why they don't trust them. It's because they see them as not taking into account their true will and just interested in how to increase their political power.
And the fall in the number of women elected to parliament.
The reasons are less or more well known. It's the stereotypes, the social prejudice, but of course the political system that is not friendly to women and does not favor their entrance in politics in general.
Finally, the crossing points between the north and the south of Cyprus are opening today. It's been in the pipeline for a while, but it took some help from the United Nations to get both sides to agree. And of course, with the pandemic still around, we do have various traffic-like systems, and the measures will be assessed every couple of weeks. Now, it's going to make a big difference to all the shopkeepers and restaurants in the areas that people usually visit when they are allowed across the divide. And joining us to talk not only about the economic but also the social aspects, we have Fiona Mullen from Sapienta Economics. Fiona, let's start, if we may, with the business side of things, because until the crossings closed, there was quite a lot of business going on across the Green Line, wasn't there?
Yes, I mean, we don't have a full breakdown of figures, but you can get an idea from the JCC figures, which are published every month. So the JCC is the plastic card spending people, so anyone with a credit card or debit card. For quite some years now, they've been publishing how much people are spending, either Turkish Cypriot spending in the south or Greek Cypriot spending in the north. So what we know is that's been rising and rising and rising every year, and it got to pre-pandemic year, the Turkish Cypriots were spending about 19 million euros in the south, and the Greek Cypriots were spending a little bit more, and there was a jump because of the whole petrol thing. The Greek Cypriots were spending 21 million. So if you think that, I don't know, I've never used a card in the north, so if you think that maybe that's only representing 20% of all spending, then you're looking at about 100 million spent on both sides in normal times, pre-pandemic times.
Which means, of course, that shopkeepers, restaurants and other businesses have suffered tremendously, well, they have everywhere during the pandemic, but that closure has meant that a huge proportion of business was lost. Now, what about the social aspects, Fiona? Because there's been, particularly from groups like Unite Cyprus Now, a huge calling over the last several months that it was just being politicised and being delayed. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, I think the agreement, the announcement on Wednesday was a good one because it sort of forced both sides to do this on a rational and a synchronised basis, which is one of the things that I'm also involved in Unite Cyprus Now. One of the things we've really called for, but it's been very personal for. I mean, I couldn't sleep last night because I was too excited about seeing my friends again. It's very you can't see your good friends for well over a year. And I'm not even Cypriot. It's like more. I think even more meaningful for those who will be crossing this evening. I think by the time this programme is published, there will have been an announcement that there will be quite a celebratory crossing at 6 to 6:30 on Friday. And I think that you'll see in the emotion how how difficult it's been for people being apart for so long, you know.
Yeah, it's been difficult, I suppose, for everybody. Now, of course, we do have, as I said, the traffic light system, and at the moment I think I'm right in saying it is orange, which means what exactly?
It means that you need to have either a rapid test or a PCR test to cross over. So the orange, you know, it's related to where is Cyprus on the global map in terms of COVID cases. I reckon it will be down to green actually in a couple of weeks, but if you look at the trend in cases. But it means if you want to cross either north or south, you need either a rapid test or a PCR test. So rapid tests are free in the south. They're not, I think they don't even exist in the north, and if they do, they're certainly not free. So that's, let's say, the next issue to sort out is let's make sure this is equal for everybody.
And, of course, what about vaccinations? Here in the south, if you've got your 2 vaccinations, or you've had COVID, or you've even had just the first dose, but 3 weeks ago, you've got your sort of COVID pass, they're calling it. So you can do pretty much what you like.
Yeah, I think, you know, they had that very sort of bureaucratic term, in due course or something, in the UN announcement. I think it was good that, you know, the World Health Organization has just authorized Sinovac, which is the one that a lot of Turkish Cypriots will have had because Turkey was supplying them with Sinovac. And Greece and Turkey have just recognise each other's vaccines as well. So I think there's no excuses left for both sides in Cyprus not to recognise each other's vaccines. But, you know, this is Cyprus, this will take a while. You know, on what basis, you know, what piece of paper are both sides going to recognise from each other? But I think it will come. I'm fairly confident it will come.
And of course we should warn people that it probably does mean as well, with the checks that will be in place, that there will possibly be queues at the crossing points while those checks are carried out. But the good news, I think, for everybody is finally all that mess and those barriers closing off the north and the south of Nicosia are gone.
Yeah, I mean, really rough calculation, but I reckon it cost the Greek Cypriot economy maybe about 65 million, and the Turkish Cypriot economy maybe as much as 80 million, just to have these closed, you know. I mean, it's a very rough calculation, but it will take me longer to do a proper one.
It gives us an indication, but I think everybody's just going to be happy to get together over a coffee or a beer. Yeah. Thanks very much indeed.
See you on the other side.
Fiona Mullin from Sapienta Economics and Unite Cyprus Now.
Keep up to date with events in Cyprus and around the world with the Cyprus News Digest.
The only other story in the news this week was Sunday's elections. We're going to have a look at what actually happened, because they were different this time, I think, to some degree at least, from any previous elections we've had. We're joined on the programme by Haris Psaltis, who is Associate Professor at the University of Cyprus of Social and Developmental Psychology. So, Haris, you've had a very good look at this, and you've been studying trends, I think, in Cyprus, not just with regard to the elections, but with regard to how people identify themselves here, and that played a part, I think, in these elections. What are your conclusions?
Yes, Rosie, there are different issues that somehow defined the result of this election, and we could enumerate a number of them. First, it's the recent issue of the Al Jazeera revelations about the corruption of politicians. But that also somehow came and enhanced a certain trend in public opinion of the last, I would say, 5 to 6 years at least, where the trust of people has been in a sharp decline in various institutions, and especially the parliament. So if you look, for example, in the results of the European Social Survey that was conducted 2 years ago, and it's one of the most prestigious comparative social surveys in the European Union, you will see that around 55% of the population does not have any trust in the parliament. And then behind that there is a distrust, not so much, in the institution, but the people who populate that institution, that is politicians and the political parties. Because if you look into the trust levels about politicians, then actually this trust goes up to more than 70% of the population.
Well, can I stop you there? Because we had an abstention rate. Is that the people who don't trust politicians? Because it seems to me a little bit of an oxymoron that you give people a chance to vote for their representatives and then they turn around and say we don't trust them.
Well, that's the oxymoron. You're right, because whereas you see that 7 out of 10 do not trust politicians, political parties, actually the majority were then voted. Because, if you see who did not vote, it's 1/3 of the population. So what does that mean? It means that many of the people who did vote were voting for an institution they did not trust. And the other element here is that from the same research we know that the vast majority of people are not informed about politics. So they don't follow the news, they don't follow discussions about politics. So what does that mean? That most of the people who voted were actually uninformed about probably what they were voting for. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But the other thing, I think also relates to some developments with the Cyprus issue. I mean, most people assume that because this period the Cyprus issue was not discussed, because it's parliamentary elections, and people are do not see immediately the connection between the Cyprus issue and the parliament, that somehow it can play a role. But if you look into the percentage of the parties that were against BBS, by the Communal Federation, back in 2016, for example, they got around 40% of the vote, and in these elections in 2021, they only got about 20% of the votes. So it was a huge blow for this pole of anti-BBS political thinking, and that actually did not surprise me at all, because in our research at the University of Cyprus, looking into the trends of how people think about the Cyprus issue, since 2007, we have seen that after Kramampana failure, there was a huge concern by many people, actually about 80%, that the status quo is not sustainable and that it's producing, if you like, results that come against the interests of principles. So, seeing that, the competitive zero-sum thinking and politics with the hydrocarbons, etc., are not actually leading anywhere, I think that's the reason that it gave this huge blow to these parties. Yes, of course, Elam was increased, but Elam is just, one small part of this greater pole of anti-bizonal communal federation political thinking. And if you look into the big picture, they have actually been hit quite hard from these elections.
But in fact, across Europe, there is an undoubted swing to the far right, isn't there?
Yeah, so what's happening here in Cyprus is that you have a concentration of that anti-bizonal communal federation thinking in the far right, but from the more mainstream, let's put it that way, parties, it's actually in a diminishing trend. So that's why I'm talking about the big picture, and that we should not just stay on the fact that Elam increased their percentage.
What about the fact that we had so many candidates this time round? That was a reflection undoubtedly of people's dissatisfaction with the way things are being handled in Cyprus, and a lot of people just saying, I'm going to stand for Parliament and change things. But it does muddy the waters for voters, doesn't it? Particularly since we don't have horizontal voting.
Yeah. Well, okay, I mean, certainly as I said earlier, there is a second trend, which is that there was this protest vote, which is the result of the Al Jazeera revelations and the corruption that became very visible. So that, from the election results, it appears that all the big traditional parties, AGEL, VC, VICO, actually are impacted in a negative way by this trend. So that's why I said from the beginning, Rosie, that there are different trends, some more ephemeral and some more long-term changes that do not always go in the same direction, and trying to explain the results in a simplistic way would be very wrong.
Right, now the fact that we do have several small parties in Parliament with more than the usual 1 or 2 seats, can you even think about how that might affect how Parliament does its job?
Yeah, well, the way it is forming now, it looks possible that there is a new party that's it's a splinter from VICO called VIBA of Mario Scarjan, which, by the way, is taking a more pro-BBS stance to connect it to my previous discussion. So this party seems it will be collaborating closely with the ruling party. That's the impression we have now. And maybe also EDEC might be joining this kind of coalition, let's put it that way. I think Elam will try to state that, we are not involved in this kind of politics, so they will try to show that they are not dealing with the other parties. That's my estimation. And I think the other coalition that might be forming, we don't know, of course, what's going to happen, but it might be AGEL, the ecologists, and VICO. So I think for the coming effort to elect a new president of the parliament, that might be the coalitions that we might have in front of us. But you never know. It's always possible that, some other, let's call it a more independent candidate might emerge that would attract more support by parties across those coalitions. Let's see.
Well, it certainly is, with the ballot boxes hardly put away, strange to me that already the horse trading has started, and it's almost inevitable that some voters are going to be extremely disappointed with the response of the parties they voted for, because they're all now jollying, aren't they, for what ministerial positions they will get if they support X, Y or Z in the presidential elections in a few years' time. So the corruption hasn't changed at all, really. It's all about personal power and personal advantage, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, if we see another of the usual scenarios of these kind of gimmicks, that would be a big disappointment for many people who voted for change in the mentality of politicians, because as we said earlier, the vast majority of people do not trust politicians and the parties, so that's one of the reasons why they don't trust them. It's because they see them as not taking into account their true will and just interested in how to increase their political power, and they are also seen as corrupted, as we said earlier. So, yeah.
There is a basic distrust, is there not? Let me ask you finally about, there were, I don't know how many thousand new registered voters, and there were also, of course, all those abstentions. Is there any indication as to whether or not particularly younger voters were the ones who registered and or the ones who also abstained?
Well, what's interesting there, Rosie, is that many of the youngsters who were allowed to go and vote actually did not even register in the electoral list. So they didn't even take advantage of their right to vote. So in a sense, the abstention rates we see are only amongst those who were registered to vote and did not choose to go and vote. But there is also another part of especially the youth, that did not even register in the electoral list.
You look at this from a developmental psychology perspective. What do you make of that?
That's a very good question, actually. And to connect some of the findings from the European Social Survey and some of our other findings from social developmental work on how students in Cyprus develop their political thinking and their stance on the Cyprus issue, what we see is that they are very much uninformed about politics. For example, on the Cyprus issue, they are not aware of the history of the Turkish Cypriot community. They have a one-sided view of the history of Cyprus, which is only a history of victimization of our own community, but failing to see the mistakes of the Greek Cypriot community towards the other community. You can see that there is content in the Lexecno policy which somehow is interested only on poverty issues and not recreating relationships, human relationships with the other community. And this kind of absence of the other community in the mind of Greek Cypriots youth can also be seen in the fact that they have less contact with the other community compared with the older generation.
All right, but can I just interrupt there and say to you that if you see any of the demonstrations about opening the crossings and getting back together, there's a huge representation there of the younger generation. So it seems to be half and half, and a lot of it, I'm sure, is down to our education system, isn't it? And the way we teach history in our schools. If you've had, 15, 16 years of brainwashing, dare I say, then it's very difficult to break out and make your own opinion, isn't it?
It is, and our system is not helping their agency, to the ability to make decisions and be more independent in thinking. We have the church that, has all these rituals embedded in the school system, going to church, doing this exomology, in the schools. We have the one-sided propaganda kind of teaching in the educational system through history teaching. So all this is doing the opposite of supporting the critical thinking of students. And once they do not develop their critical thinking, they will not become political agents that would first understand what's happening around them, and second, have the will to change what is happening around them. So these are the two major problems, and I think they are all connected. I think very few people today see that corruption is connected to the unresolved Cyprus problem, for example. But actually, they are the two faces of the same coin. The corrupted politicians that just serve their own interests with having the problem unresolved, unfortunately.
It's all very depressing, if you ask me. Your studies into not just the sort of Cypriot side of things, but the European side will presumably continue. When can we expect the next social survey?
Well, the next round of the European Social Survey is actually starting just next month. So we'll have our next findings, hopefully, early next year.
We'll look forward to seeing if indeed there are any developments. That is Haris Psaltis, Associate Professor of Social and Developmental Psychology at the University of Cyprus. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Roger.
One of the notable outcomes of the elections was that despite the fact that Cyprus is among the top countries for the fewest female members of Parliament, we lost even more. Joining us is the Gender Equality Commissioner for Cyprus, Iosifina Antoniou. Iosifina, can I ask you, you must be disappointed by this because we've been trying for years, as far as I know, to increase the number of women, not just in Parliament, but in decision-making circles in Cyprus, and this was a setback, wasn't it?
Of course, I'm very disappointed. The results of the parliamentary elections are really very bad. Are very bad because we start from 2011 8 MPs, women MPs. We raised this percentage at 2016 on 17.8%. And sometimes in the parliament, the last parliament, the percentage was 21.4 because after the reshuffle of the government, male MPs left to take ministerial positions and were replaced by women in line by chance. In other words, it happened to be women whose turn was in the making of the results of these previous elections. Anyway, now the reality is that we have 14.3% represented by women in this parliament, and of course it's not considered equal and balanced participation in this legislature.
Why do you think it is that so few women, it's not that they're not standing, there were plenty of women on the ballots, weren't there?
Look, the reasons are less or more well known. Is the stereotypes, the social prejudice, but of course in the political system that is not friendly to women and does not favor their interest in politics in general.
They're also underrepresented in government positions. What can you, as Gender Equality Commissioner, do about this, if anything? I mean, in other countries, and I'm not personally in favour of it, but they do have quotas. Is that an answer here?
Yes, we can't have quotas in Cyprus because our constitution doesn't permit that. We know very well that the most effective positive action measure is the quota, which has been implemented in other countries, and they had, of course, very great results. Unfortunately, in Cyprus, the quotas cannot be applied because they violate the Article 28 of our constitution. Efforts in the future will be made to amend this article. So we can have quotas in Cyprus, we can use these positive action measures, and we have to look in other ways to reason the percentage of the women in the politics.
Is it that people just don't vote for women because we are still very much a patriarchal society, and yet we have lots of very successful business women, for example?
Yes, this is the reason, and all this, the patriarchal society, is the stereotypes and the social prejudice that I referred before. We have a Mediterranean model of country which the patriarchy is very, very strong. So they put in their mind the women in the private sector and the men in the public sector. Simple, just like that. So you asked me before what we can do. We try to convince that the women are very necessary in every government, in every parliament. You know, the increased participation of women in MPs particularly, it's not a matter of numerical achievement for women, but they perform a role of political action with benefits in areas where, let's say that women have show greater sensitivity. That areas are, for example, education, health, social affairs, labor justice, and protection of the vulnerable groups. So for that, men and women must be in the parliament, in the government, because they have different priorities.
They bring something totally different, don't they, to the mix,
yes,
as it were?
Yes, of course.
All right, well, we are hoping, I suppose, over the years that we can get back up to a more representative number of women in public life. Many thanks to our Gender Equality Commissioner, Ioasafina Antoniou, for joining me.
Thank you very much, Rosie. Thank you.
Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.